if you want to explore shamanic leadership, you need to get in touch with your both of your polarities around power. Like, in other ways, it's not just about becoming a good leader, it's also about becoming a great follower. And how can we do that? How can we explore both of those polarities and make space for both and get the juice and the magic of both? And I find that oftentimes, in at least personal development, there is a lot of focus on how to be a leader. Like, everyone wants to be a leader. But truthfully, if you cast yourself in the role of a leader for too long, it's similar to casting oneself in the role of the masculine for too long. Something will crack, something will give, something will feel incomplete. And again, something will need to be repressed and suppressed for that to happen.
So what could that look like practically? So someone's leading an organization. How do you connect to those other polarities? Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fathers, Sons, Brothers podcast. I'm so stoked to have you checking in today and really excited to introduce today's guest to you, whose name is Raffaello Manacorda. The reason it's such a special episode for me is because in 2018, I attended my first ISTA training. The International School of Temple Arts offers a week-long residential retreat, meaning you stay on site for a week and work through a range of different processes that allow you to get reconnected and unblock life force energy, the life force that you hold in the body. You learn some practical tools around communication, as well as clearing guilt and shame around sexuality. And the work that they do has been so profound and so transformational for me on my path that I can't recommend it enough. Rafa was the male facilitator that supported me through that first ISTA training. And one of the sort of practices that they did as part of this ISTA training was a men's circle. And this was the first time I'd really been in a men's circle outside of some work that I did many years ago. But the space was so well held, and a function of the overall week-long container that I was a part of, I really felt comfortable and safe enough to go into the circle of men and to speak openly for the first time about my relationship with sexuality, which in the past actually looked like sex addiction, where I was connecting with multiple women. It was very shadowy. I felt a lot of guilt and shame around my connections, but it felt like my sexual energy was driving me in some way. Rafa held the space in this men's circle where I stepped in, allowed myself for the first time to speak to a circle of men who I didn't know except for the couple of days that we had already been on this retreat. And I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but that men's circle was so profound for me in my healing journey of being witnessed without judgment by the men that were in that circle, that when I stepped back, having shared my experience, I felt like I had put down this heavy rock that I had been carrying for most of my life. And I don't know if I definitely didn't have any tools available to me at the time. And I don't know whether I would have had any tools in my life in the future other than that sacred men's circle to put down that rock and to feel light and liberated. Because for the first time, I felt like I'd put down this big, heavy monster that I'd been carrying on my back for most of my life. Not only was that so profound, but throughout the rest of the week, at various times, other men that were part of that circle came up to me and said, Gareth, thank you so much for what you shared there. It really resonated with me. I felt something similar and it moved them. And in that moment, it just suddenly dawned on me. I was like, holy fuck, this technology of men's work is so unbelievably powerful, because not only had I had this huge transformation of feeling like I'd put down something that I'd been carrying for most of my life, but multiple other men came up to me and shared something similar that they had been holding. And I realized that those are only the men that came up to me. And I recognized that when other men stepped into the circle to share what they'd been holding, it wasn't always about sexuality. I think the frame of that particular circle was share something that feels heavy that you haven't perhaps shared before. I can't remember how it was held. But other people shared things, and I was like, wow, I'm not the only one who has money stuff or stuff with my mom or stuff with my dad. And that was such a profound moment for me on my journey that it's shaped my work, that's created this podcast, the Fathers, Sons, Brothers tribe, the monthly men's circle that we hold called the King Circle, our online men's circle. And Rafa was the being that held that container. And it felt so profound to, yeah, circle back around. And it's actually the first time we've really connected again since that training. And yeah, it's been almost 6 years since we last connected. So super excited to be introducing today's guest. Rafa is an international Tantra teacher and a practitioner. He's been practicing Tantra for more than 15 years, and he's undergone intensive training in several styles of yoga. After completing an MA in philosophy, Rafa decided to spend more than 12 years living in alternative communities and experimenting with radically alternative lifestyles. It was in these wild years that he first encountered Tantra, the rebel way to spirit. This encounter developed into a lifelong practice, first on a solo journey and then studying Tantra and yoga in some of the best schools around the world. Rafa serves as the lead faculty inside ISTA, and which is the International School of Temple Arts, which I was just talking about, and he teaches and lectures worldwide. He's currently enrolled in a PhD program in wisdom studies with Ubiquity University in California. Rafa is also the co-creator of the ISTA Practitioner Training, and this is ISTA's program for coaches and practitioners in the field of conscious sexuality. This conversation really, for me, covered three really powerful themes. The first we touched on was this role of archetypes. And I've spoken about this before. I have my own body of work around this tool that I have called the Inner Kingdom. But it's really recognizing that we have access to multiple different versions or personas that exist inside us. And Rafa talks about the fact that for many of us, we're only accessing about 20% of our conscious experience of ourselves, but using tools like archetypes, you get access to around 80%. You get the opportunity to access the other 80% that you don't otherwise have access to unless you use a tool like archetypes. We spend probably about 40 minutes deep diving into archetypes. Rafa defines what they are. He speaks about how to access them. He speaks about some of the archetypes that many men don't have access to and just how much power is unlocked when you tap into some of these archetypes. He also talks about what you can use this power for to be able to create things in your life, to be able to call in partnership, to be able to level up the projects that you're creating and really access more life force energy by using this tool of archetypes. Next, we dived into conscious sexuality. This is Rafa's main body of work and where he spends a lot of his time facilitating workshops, and a lot of the work that's done inside the ISTA training has to do with conscious sexuality. And we spoke about some really powerful ways to be able to shift our relationship to sexuality by bringing awareness and presence. And Rafa talks about some powerful techniques actually that you can use to level up your lovemaking. You can practically use them in the bedroom. And he also talks about the ability to be able to separate your ejaculation from your orgasm and why you might want to do that. It's an amazingly powerful topic. Make sure you stick around for that. And then we finished the conversation talking about leadership, and we spoke about some of the challenges that the old paradigm of leadership has, some of the potential pathways of what a new, he calls it shamanic leadership, may look like. He talks about what shamanic leadership is and some of the different polarities that exist inside leadership, and how you can improve your role as a leader by recognizing these polarities and including some practical ways that you can level up the other polarity. And when you do that, it makes you a more complete and integrated leader. It's a super powerful conversation. I'm really excited to share this with you. Before we dive in, I want to share a couple of announcements with you. Rafa also, as I shared, speaks a lot about the role of healing masculinity and supporting men to be able to show up more fully. And one of the ways that I have taken this work and this technology of men's work and supported it, not only in my own life, but also for the work that I share inside the Father, Sons, Brothers community, is our free monthly men's circle called the King Circle. And the King Circle is a 2-hour investment. It has no financial investment. You have to obviously invest the 2 hours to be there. But when you show up to the King Circle, we hold a safe and secure container to explore topics like leadership, to talk about shadow work, to talk about how to access some of the parts of ourselves that we perhaps don't have access to normally, and how we can integrate these parts in a safe container of men for 2 hours once a month. And when you leave the King Circle, you will have more access to life force. You will have access to tools and specific let's call them frameworks that you can use to make yourself a better leader, to make yourself a better lover, to make yourself a better husband, and to be a better father. And one of the magical components of showing up at the King Circle regularly is that the collective intelligence of our container is starting to grow. As I record this, we've done 29 King Circles. King Circle 30 is coming up soon. And the men that start to show up have really started to build really strong bonds and ties with one another and continue to support one another as we go through the various paths and pitfalls that we're inherently part of the path of being a human being, whether it's relationship challenges or leadership challenges or business failures. All of those themes are welcome inside this container. It's an opportunity for you to share the same way I did and maybe put down some of those rocks that you feel like you're having to carry on your own. I'll include a link to the King Circle. If you haven't checked one out before, we are open and welcoming of men of all ages, races, stages, and places. Anybody that lives in a male body that wants some support and the ability to be able to show up more fully as a leader, lover, father, brother, the King Circle is an opportunity for you to do that. So, King Circle, link in the show notes. We are also really excited to be relaunching our relationship mastery program, which is called From Solo to Soulmate. This is a 12-week, super powered relationship masterclass that helps you touch on some of the topics that we talk about inside this podcast with Rafa. We talk about the role of reclaiming your sexual power, getting rid of some of the fear, guilt, and shame that you have around intimacy. We all have it as a function of being born into the world that we're in. Rafa actually spoke really beautifully about the role of like Christianity and how our society has actually given us some like a framework for relationships and for intimacy that is not always that healthy. So this relationship program is really going to support clear some of that and make you a better lover in the bedroom. We also talk about some practical tools that you can use to manifest partnership into your life and actually workshop this in this 12 weeks to practice some of the communication frameworks that will help you call in partnership, help you feel more confident to attract a partner. And if you're in a partnership, it'll give you some practical ways to help diffuse some of the bombs that perhaps are unfolding in your relationship right now. Communication frameworks, shadow work tools. We use the archetypes quite extensively inside this training program. The way to join From Solo to Soulmate is through a really sweet 20-minute masterclass that we created called the Soulmate Safari. Ranger G is going to guide you on the three core elements of how to show up more fully in your partnerships and how to manifest and maintain a solid primary relationship. A link to the Soulmate Safari will be in the show notes of this episode. And if you're looking to call in partnership, so you're single and you want to manifest a partner into your life, but maybe you feel like you've been in some relationship loops or manifesting unsuitable partners, this is going to be for you. Likewise, if you're in a partnership at the moment and you feel like you need some support and tools to help you take it to the next level, maybe the fire's gone out and you need to reignite some of the fire inside your partnership, or maybe you just feel like you don't have the resources to be able to communicate effectively and understand your partner in a meaningful way, make sure you check out the Soulmate Safari. I'll leave a link in the show notes below. Enjoy this episode with Raffaello Manacorda. Brother, welcome to the Father, Sons, Brothers podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. Good to be here.
It's been a hot minute. We met probably 6 years ago when I got into my first ISTA training. You were a facilitator at one of the first ISTAs, the first ISTA that I did. And I was also pretty fresh in my relationship with Minter. So it feels good to be hanging out with you again, man. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here.
Yeah, no, super happy to be here. And actually, I had heard of you before that training, so somehow it feels like I've known you from a little bit before that, a few months before.
And even though it's been a while since you and I had a conversation, I also feel like I've heard so much about you through Araminta and through what's been moving through ISTA. So yeah, man, it's good to hang in person. I want to kick off the show with a question that I ask most of my guests in a male body. The show is called Father, Sons, Brothers, and I'd love you to share a story about the role that you've played either as a father, son, or brother, or the relationship that you've had with a father, son, or brother, just as I wait for the guest to get to know who you are.
Sure. So I'm not a father, so at least not biologically. So I'll go to the son or brother. And actually, It's interesting that you ask this question. My family of origin was a very male dominated family. So it's my father, myself, a male brother of mine, and my mother. I do have a half sister, but we never lived together. And so me and my younger brother, I'm the elder, me and my younger brother, we have 9 years in between.
Oh wow.
So it's like a certain, big or considerable difference means that I remember very clearly the moment that my younger brother came to this world. I was 9 years old. I was like, a kid,
Yeah.
and I was used to be a lone child, or a solo solo traveler in the
Yeah.
journey of being a son, and I
Yeah.
really really wanted to have a brother. I didn't want to have a sister necessarily. I wanted a brother. So somehow I feel, or the story goes, that I insisted so much and was so like determined with my parents that I wanted a brother. They were done. They were done. My father was 48. He was done. Um, that one day they summoned me to their bed, to their bedroom, and sat me down. Kind of. I was 8 and a half, and they said, "Okay, so we got a huge surprise for you." And I said, "What, like the new video game that I've just seen?" And they're like, "No, no, something better." I was like, "Better than that? I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know what you're talking about. You're gonna have a brother." And that was like one of my, Satori moments in my life, because I knew something in my soul knew that I needed to have a brother. And the interesting and beautiful thing is that my younger brother and I are very close. We live very close together. He has got a son. I haven't got any, but he has got a son. So actually, tomorrow morning I'm gonna see them, and there is this beautiful male, lineage. My father passed almost 20 years ago, and there is this beautiful lineage between me, my brother, and my brother's son that somehow touches on all those archetypes, even though it's not directly a father-son relationship.
Beautiful. How you said at the beginning of that, not biologically. What did you mean by that? Where do you see your role as a father that hasn't got biological implications?
So, I love archetypes. I think a lot in terms of archetypes. And one very simple answer to that question is that even though I'm not a biological father, I do get projected father on a lot, right? So it's like, even though I'm not a biological father, there is no shortage of people in this world that have somehow, consciously or not, had parental projections on me because of my role and the mission that I have in life. And so I'm not a biological father, but as an archetypal father, I definitely have been that. Whether I knew it or not, it's a different story, and there's a lot to talk about that.
We're going to get into archetypes because, yeah, I'm super interested in that. You said your mission, and I'd love you to share a little bit about what you define your mission to be and how, yeah, how you spend your time in the world.
So my mission in life has had well, not many, a few incarnations, not many. I don't know that I would be able to like summarize it, let's say, in a mission statement, but clearly right now, and it has been this way for 7 years,
Hmm.
my mission is to dedicate my energy, my time, my capacities to the creation of transformational containers for people to step into. And the way that I do it on a practical level in this moment, as you know, mostly but not exclusively, is by being part of a larger group of humans or a larger organization or organism that's called ISTA. But of course, this is one embodiment of a purpose. And what I know in my life is that I've been through cycles of being on purpose and off purpose, and I know very well how those two distinct feelings are. And
Mm.
right now I'm definitely in an on purpose part of my life, so I am aligned. I am doing what I need to do. Of course there's obstacles and challenges, but there is not that sense of like, what am I doing with my life, that I've definitely had before.
Mm.
So right now, my mission is very much connected to this collective creation, but it could be different in a different time of my life. But it has to do with transformation and awakening of human beings.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for doing that work and for being on purpose. And I've got a question. Does that on purpose, off purpose process that people go through, is that a natural cycle, or do you think that's just something that happens as a function of you outgrowing a specific phase? And maybe when somebody feels like they're not on purpose, what are your suggestions of how they come back into, yeah, being in charge and in line with what it is that they feel that they're called to do?
In my personal theory and a theory of life, the on cycle, off cycle is a characteristic of the masculine. When I say the masculine, I mean the masculine both in men and women and people of all genders and orientations. It's not that it's not exclusive to men. And then the feminine in all of us has other kinds of cycles. But yeah, the on purpose, off purpose is, in my perception, a function of the masculine. The movement between these two is not predictable or necessarily rhythmic, as in the case of the feminine. So you could be off purpose for 5 years and on purpose for one, or vice versa. So I don't know that
Hmm.
there is a cadence to that. And what I suggest to people that are in the off track or off purpose phase is to embrace it, to not get busy, to not try to get shit done, but actually to become receptive, embrace the loss, embrace the sense of limbo and sometimes of confusion that can bring, which can be very difficult for the masculine in us. But know that that phase of receptivity is needed because we've just busted through one layer of purpose, and before the next manifests, usually we do need to get lost for some time. But in that moment of being lost, signals are coming, things are coming. So if we are attentive to them, then we make the off purpose phase more effective and not procrastinate it too long.
Mm, yeah. Would you say that off-purpose phase has a little bit more to do with being in more a feminine polarity, of being open to receptivity and being able to receive and listen?
Yeah, I would say that, like everything is a fractal of everything, so you can split it always in two and assign masculine and feminine. But yes, definitely, if we take on purpose and off purpose and put them side by side, the off purpose would be the more receptive. And I could also use the word feminine. I mean, again, only in the side of that being receptive, because that's not to suggest in any way that the feminine in all of us is more lost or less,
No, no,
has
no.
less of a
Yeah,
direction. But
yeah.
yeah, for many men, for example, one of the challenges about the off-purpose phase is learning to surrender, be receptive, be attentive. One thing I want to say, we could talk about this for hours, but one of the beautiful characteristics of the off-purpose phase, if taken in a mature way, which I didn't for most of my life, and probably I wouldn't, is that we can be much more in the present moment, because we're not like an arrow targeted towards the future. When I am on purpose, obviously the future and the past do have a weight in my consciousness because I am directed somewhere. But when I am off purpose, that's exactly the time when I can allow myself to go out of my house and wander the streets, not knowing where I'm going, and follow a bird here and a sound there. And that's exactly what I'm meant to do when I am off purpose, but I don't always remember to do that.
How does somebody who's showing up in their day-to-day routine, doing a job, following it, recognize that they might not be on purpose? What are the indications that you're doing what you've been called to do?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Um, I feel the first thing I want to say about it is that, in my perception anyway, our society is not built to understand these things and to honor these things as many other things. So if you're taking the example of a 9 to 5 job, then there is a huge incentive to never go off purpose, to always be productive, to always be on top of things, to always be geared towards doing and aligning one's personal purpose in general with the purpose of the corporation that someone is working in, and all kinds of things that are maybe effective in terms of the capitalistic system, but not necessarily aligned with how humans work. So, what are the signs of we're starting to drift towards the off-purpose phase? Well, usually the signs is like the same thing that I was doing for years and that filled me with energy when I was waking up in the morning. I was like, okay, great, let me go to work. I love this job. I'm doing something meaningful and impactful. All of a sudden starts to feel empty. It starts to feel like nothing changed. So I may be very, very confused about why. I may be doing. It might happen to me. It might happen to me in a year from now or 6 months from now or whatever. I might get up to do my nth training that I love and I enjoy, and I might feel I'm not energized. It feels empty. And so paradoxically, we reach the off-purpose phase oftentimes either through failure or through success. Oftentimes we exhaust a purpose because we succeeded in it. So it's done. It's done what it needed to do in our existence. So I think those are the signs. Starting to fantasize about being somewhere else,
Hmm.
starting to feel more alive when I imagine myself stopping this activity that I'm doing versus when I imagine myself doing it. And catching those signs is problematic because they bring up emotions. They can bring up shame and guilt, all kinds of things.
Feeling
But they
guilty
are
about the
signs.
fact that I have a job and I'd want to do something else. So I feel guilty about that.
Yeah, and also especially feeling guilty about the fact that I may have people depending on me doing my job
Right.
well, and family that is that I'm supporting, all kinds of things.
Hmm. Do you see that purpose and job have to be linked together?
The concept of job is a very recent construct in human history, if you wish. For the longest time, humans didn't have a job. So, if we talk archetypes, I would probably argue that the archetype of job doesn't even exist. It's too young of a thing to have even become an archetype. On the
Hmm.
other hand, purpose is a very ancient thing. There's definitely is an archetype of purpose. So when we're putting purpose and job together, it's like a very ancient and big psychic construct, which is purpose, that could overlap, but doesn't necessarily overlap with a super young and recent human creation, which is the job, like the 9 to 5 job. So this is one of the tragedies I believe of modern life. They don't always overlap. They might, but jobs haven't been created with purpose in mind. They have been created for a utilitarian, system. So they don't necessarily have to align, and the experience of many people is that they don't, because jobs are a completely different creature than purpose. When they do align, however, you will probably find that someone has a really hard time describing what they do as a job. Like this is
Yes.
my case.
Yes.
I'd rather call it a mission or an endeavor or a collective creation or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. I think I would love to drop into the conversation around archetypes and maybe start with the question of how you define an archetype if somebody perhaps hasn't used this as a placeholder for what you've been talking about. So how do you define an archetype?
It's a great question. I teach classes on that, and it's always tricky with definitions. But with archetype, one thing that can support us is the very word archetype, which was
Hmm.
introduced at least to popular culture and particularly to psychological jargon by Carl Gustav Jung, as you probably know, like in the early decades of the 20th century. So archetype comes from two Greek roots that are put together. And one of those roots is arche, which means something ancient, primal, original. Like you
Hmm.
could you could think like the mold of something that generates a million copies. Like that's arche. That's like something primitive and
Hmm.
primal, but not in the sense of that being unevolved, just in the sense of that being the first.
Uh-huh.
And then type or tupon or tupos, I'm not sure with Greek here, means form or shape or category, if you will.
Okay.
So the archetypes are really sort of like, molds that exist somewhere, and we can talk more about where. And that a lot of our individual experiences and behaviors and things that we see, do, feel are simply variations or products of that one single mold.
Okay.
So, in the same way that we can have the mold or the archetype of father, for instance, and then it can show up in so many different ways in individual experience, but they're all linked together by something very potent and, in a certain sense, very real. So, this is not abstract, but it is real because there is a very real substrate of reality where these archetypes exist.
Got it. Okay. So we know more or less what they are. Why? Why would we be interested in this? What's the idea of studying this? Can you give some examples so someone now understands where the word comes from and what it means? Why would we be interested in this and how can it support someone listening to the show?
The reason why we would be interested in that is because, again, in the at least in Western culture, but in the early decades of the 20th century and also last decade of the century before, a number of people discovered that what exists inside of us is not all conscious. What I see inside of myself is maybe, let's say, 20% of what actually is there. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Uh huh.
So my inner world is full of content that I do not see, but that content influences my life in a massive way. And using very broad terms, that content is called the unconscious. And the unconscious is a very big term, but basically the discovery, mainly of Jung and others, was that part of that unconscious, part of that content that I do not see, is not something that I have learned or experienced or even has anything to do with my individual life. It's a common unconscious pool of stuff that pretty much every human being shares, and it's called the collective unconscious. And in the same way, that you could say a bird, when a bird is born, a bird has the instinct to fly. No one has taught the bird to fly. It has the instinct to do it. It's part of their collective unconscious. And in a similar way, our collective unconscious as humans is populated by many things, and amongst them, archetypes. So, understanding archetypes literally means understanding oneself better because I can understand part of my unconscious, but it also means understanding other humans in a very specific way that's beyond race, gender, political opinions, age. Now, that's not to say that the collective unconscious is eternal. It is not eternal, but it moves and changes in much longer cycles than one individual lifespan. So to all intents and purposes, it's kind of, it can feel like it is eternal, although it is not, because it changes so much more slowly than our individual ideas and thoughts. And a lot of what we do and feel and experience is dictated by what exists in the collective unconscious in the form of archetypes.
Such a great description. Thank you, bro. That was sweet. So, like, what you've used an idea of an archetype and you've used father, but what else could somebody understand an archetype to be if you gave some practical examples? So, this idea of a collective unconscious that has access or data that we can all tap into and all have, essentially part of us built into us. What would some other archetypes be, just for the sake of explanation?
There is a lot of them. There is probably an infinite number of them, but I was just reflecting, which is interesting, that your podcast's name is uses three words, and all of the three of them are archetypes, and probably not by chance, because by saying father, brothers, and sons, you can connect to millions of humans, billions of humans that will understand because you are tapping into archetypes. So, father is an archetype, son is an archetype, brother is an archetype, and mother, sister, and daughter as well.
Yeah.
And then there's some archetypes that are maybe, I could say nowadays starting to be popular again, such as, for example, shadow. Shadow is an archetype.
Okay.
Um, Even, this is a bit of a more complicated discussion, but on some level, you could say that God or goddess is in itself an archetype as well, although it is not any archetype. It is, in a way, a special archetype. And in more psychological parlance, there is another special archetype that's called the self with a capital S, that holds a special place in these constellations. And then another one is persona. So anything basically that's liable to be felt and understood by millions of people across cultures, across social state, social class, and all kinds of different individual differences is probably correlated to an archetype.
Mm. Okay, and then practically, how do we use these to get to know ourselves better? So these infinite number of descriptors exist for energetic forms. How do we actually tune into these to get to know ourselves better, assuming that we've only got access to 20% consciously of what's going on inside us?
Yeah, so the first of all, the small percentage of what we have access to is something that can be changed. It can be changed through introspection and all kinds of work, whether embodied work, which is the style that I prefer nowadays, but also more just self introspection. And then once we start tuning into the world and language of archetypes, there's plenty of things we can do with them. For example, one of the things that Jung himself and others love to do was what's called free association. And this could be done verbally, but also by painting or by any creative action, like with clay or with paint or drawing on the sand, and just allowing the consciousness to draw liberally, but giving it, for example, a starting point. Like father could be a starting point. If I tune into my experience of father and do my best to interrupt my opinions, judgments, and all kinds of filters that I have, and just allow, let's say, my words or my paintbrush to draw father, what will emerge? And I would be surprised. I might, let's say, draw a figure with a beard, or maybe two horns, or maybe a huge eye, that's looking at me, or maybe a fire. And then I start navigating this archetypal world, and I start discovering associations that I didn't know that I had. I might, for example, discover an association between father and fire. This is just a pure example. What does that mean? It's giving me information about myself, but potentially also about humanity in general. Um, it's, for example, quite well known that in many cultures there is an association, an archetypal association between father and bread. Similarly, as between mother and milk, which is
Okay,
perhaps more obvious. And
right.
when I start exploring those associations, I might understand, for example, why having bread on my table gives me a sense of comfort and security. It's not just because it feeds me, it's because it makes me feel that, oh, the father energy is somewhere near, and that gives me comfort. I'm just
Mm.
sort of like exploring a little bit, improvising here, but this is the kind of directions that association and understanding and exploration of archetypes can take us to.
Mm. So would you say that somebody's born with like a primary sort of coded archetype that they're aware of and they're not, then don't have access to others, or do we all have similar archetypes, or sort of how do you see that in the role that a specific imprint plays on a specific human being?
So the theory goes, and I think it's a good theory, that all of us are born with, let's say, an identical set of archetypes, or whatever that means in archetypal language. You can never compare exactly bit by bit. So, and when we are born, and for a long time, we do not have access to them in a conscious way. So like now we can talk about the archetype of father because we are putting our attention on it, but for the longest time in our lives we didn't know that there was an archetype of father. We just knew that there was a father, or the absence of a father, or maybe a man that we unconsciously wanted to be the archetype of father. And one of the amazing things and fascinating things is that a lot of our drama and disappointment in life might come, according to this theory, by the fact that archetypes have very pure and sort of like defined qualities, whereas human beings are very mutable, and very changeable. So if I took that man to be father as an archetype, sooner or later he must have done something that didn't match, with the archetype of father, and that
Yes.
would have been painful to witness for a child. So a lot of our pain comes from the juxtaposition of perfect and pure and powerful archetypes with fallible, immutable, and unpredictable human beings.
And so if someone's got a specific coding that they sort of adapt as a function of learning this, how do you tap into the other archetypes as a way to grow as a person or to become more integrated through accessing other archetypes? How could that look? Is that the
For
journey that you're talking
example,
about with the drawing, or that journey, or is there
yeah,
other
for
ways
example,
to
in my
check into it?
case, yeah, in my case, as you probably know, at some point I decided to go into the field of embodied spirituality. There's different subgroups, and so I discovered that there were very powerful ways to access those archetypes through my body, right? So, for example, there was a moment in my life where I wanted to touch more or connect more deeply with the archetype of the wild man inside of me, the uncivilized wild man. This is a powerful archetype, the wild man as well. Also, the wild woman, that's a different story. And so, of course, I could have journaled, I could have, thought about it, I could have done verbal association, but it was much more powerful to go towards it with the help and the support of my body. What did that mean? That meant putting myself through processes, rituals, ceremonies, however you want to call them, in nature, many of them in nature, but with an awareness that what I was doing, also, besides having fun and having challenges and growing and crying and all of that, was consciously tuning in and connecting to that archetype. So I could go naked in the forest and be nonverbal for some time and roll in the grass and touch and smell and open my senses to the forest, also as a way to connect to that archetype better and in a deeper way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I want to go a little deeper on that question. What made you choose that archetype? What did you see in your life that made you say this is the one that I'm going to choose out of an infinite possibility?
So, I mean, the wild man is just one of the archetypes that I work with, but that one was a very, very important for me to work on, basically because I was born and raised as a city boy. That's my biography. I grew up in Rome, big city, very interested in technology since an early age, and at the same time, I had easy access to my sexual to the sexual part of me, to my sexual desires, to my sexual energy.
Hmm.
However, between my civilized self and my sexual self, there was a huge gap. Like all the part in between that has to do, on one hand, with the emotional capacity of a human being was very dormant for me. So I had to do a lot of work on that. But also, the part of me that's just an animal and that has instincts and that has also survival instincts, for example, and capacity to smell a situation, I had collapsed that animal part with the sexual part. In other words, just to rephrase it in a different way, all through my teenager years, the only way for me to be uncivilized, and if you wish, unintellectual, was through either in sexual situations or when my sexuality was present,
Yeah,
or through drugs, which is another shortcut that many of us use. I
yeah.
didn't have any other access to the part of me that's uncivilized, that's animal, and it's not necessarily sexual. So I had to do work on it. I couldn't
Mm,
access it easily. And maybe if I had been raised in in nature, or in a more uh, traditional and close to nature society, that wouldn't have been a problem for me. But it was
mm.
because of the way I grew up.
It's such a powerful one. And I think so many men in our community, some of the content of ours that's done the best, and it's also a function of my own upbringing, is the archetype slash role that we've played as men in people pleasing, the wanting to show up for others continually, always checking in. And I think that the way that you show up in relationship with that has its superpowers, but where you don't have access to the more dark, maybe more wild man type energy, it can become pretty unhealthy in a connection. And there's a part of me that this is definitely an edge for me to work on. And for men listening to this that, potentially don't have access to that, meaning like especially in the bedroom, to not be able to access some of the dark and really take away some of the polarity. And I think we're navigating a pretty tricky time around this because people haven't necessarily seen that use of power and maybe even the word taking in a safe way in a sexual environment to be able to be embodied in a healthy way. And I think there's definitely collectively quite a lot of work to do around this particular archetype. Would you say it's linked to the people pleaser, like it's some way, like a different polarity to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're touching here on so many powerful archetypes, and what I mostly love about what you just said, Garrett, is that you touched on to a very, very painful split here, which is the light dark, conundrum. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. Like any human being, whether male or female, that disconnects a healthy capacity to connect with some of the healthy light archetypes and some of the healthy dark archetypes is going to suffer consequences, as you said. And so, for example, people pleaser, when we talk about people pleaser, what's really jarring about it, in my opinion, like, on face value, someone that is helpful to others and wants others to be happy is, why not? Sounds like an amazing thing to be around. But the problem with that is that the people pleaser, when it becomes like a crystallized behavior, is deeply and profoundly inauthentic,
Mm.
right? So it's the person that has a smile on their face and wants everybody to be happy, while actually they're steeping in anger or having other kinds of emotional things going on. So the
Hmm.
inauthenticity of that behavior is what's difficult for anybody really to accept, because the truth behind that is that every human being is naturally inclined to be both light and dark, both masculine and feminine in different proportions. But
Hmm.
we all have learned to sort of like cut off some of that psychic content as non-acceptable, and that's inevitable in the growth of any socialized human being. But then we need to painstakingly undo, that conditioning
Mm.
and and rejoin those parts that we had exiled. But just to finish, to give an interesting counterexample,
Yeah.
it's totally conceivable that someone who grew up, let's say, in a gang, for example, would have the opposite journey. They would
Yes.
really have to learn how to connect to the light archetypes, to the I don't know, maybe to the healthy people pleaser is not the right word, but like to the part that can be generous, kind, and a little bit naive, because that part that exists in them would probably have been suppressed and repressed because of the environment that they grew up with. So everybody has a different, part of themselves, of their psychic totality cut off, and we all need to work hard to reconnect to it.
Hey, FSB crew, a quick message to say 97% of you who watch or consume this podcast are not subscribed. Subscribing to the show really supports us to be able to grow and reach more people, as well as include and improve the quality and caliber of guests that we have on this show. Our goal is to get this number down to 70%. And so if you have ever received any value from the content and conversations on this podcast, please consider subscribing. It really supports us and the work that we're doing. Now, back to the show. This is a question actually for me and probably for other people listening to this. Like, I have a difficult time, and it's my edge to work on is bringing that wild man space slash dark energy into the bedroom. And what is a way to develop that? How do you develop these parts of yourself if you recognize this? Like for me, well, I can explain what it looks like. It has a lot to do with like continually checking in and making sure that my partner's okay every time I'm in a lovemaking situation. And like you said, beautiful for a while, and then it somehow lacks almost 50% of the energy that's available, but I don't know that I can access it so easily. What's the way to do that? And straight up, we've actually been a little bit frozen in this particular polarity in our connection over the last few years. And it's because of my upbringing, the polite boy slash people pleaser part of me, hasn't found a way to access that energy in a healthy way. And if you have any suggestions about what that could be, I think it would definitely support me and probably some other people listening.
Yeah, totally, totally feeling you. And I've had this conversation, many, many times before, and it's partly my own journey in the past, especially in my teens. So I think it's a really beautiful question to ask, and even the fact that a man is asking that question means that already they're willing to make a difference between accessing healthy darkness in the bedroom and being a rapist, because that's the terror basically, right, that lurks behind.
Right. The lack of
Like,
safety or, yeah,
yeah,
consent
am I going to
maybe.
create, exactly, am I going to create a abuse, am I going to create some non-consensual situation? And it's, it's ironic because obviously the men that ask themselves those questions are very unlikely to create any horrible non-consensual situation, but the interrogation is fair because the risk is there.
Right.
So how can we lean into that exploration? And I think really the way is to create containers, limited containers, with your partner or with whoever you can explore those energies, limited containers where that exploration can be safe for both, because the sense of unsafety can be present for both, for
Right.
both the one that's in an active role or in a more receptive role. And
Mm.
what that can look like could be, all right, I want to explore, going a little bit more into my dark, savage, wild man archetype in the bedroom. Would you be willing
Mm-hmm.
to support me and to experience that with me? And of course, if the other person says no, it's no. But if they say yes, then a good next step could be, all right, let's create a container. A container means we're gonna play this out for a number of minutes. It's not forever. There's a time container.
Mm-hmm.
So actually setting an alarm is a really good thing.
Okay.
And then we're going to have certain boundaries. And maybe in a first exploration, the boundary could be no penetration or even no nudity. It's still good because energies are energies and they can be
Mm-hmm.
accessed in different ways. Then it might be also having a safe word, which
Mm-hmm.
means the person who is in, like, in the other polarity knows that if they say red, everything stops.
Okay.
And then with all those caveats put in place, then now, as you were saying very beautifully, now my job is, okay, can I trust the container and my partner enough that I allow myself to go into that energy, and maybe I don't need to check in every 2 minutes. Are you okay? Are you doing well? Because I trust that the container is taking care of that.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean that I can ever lose presence. Like, there can always be a moment where I do need to check in, like something happens. I see my partner, looking a bit confused and dazed. I'm like, hey, how are you doing? So that check-in is beautiful and warranted. But the constant checking in, which can come from a fear, of going into a hurtful situation, or even more, even beyond an abusive situation, could be mitigated by having created together a very good container. And this is, by the way, basically in a nutshell what the BDSM community does when they create scenes, right? They create very clear containers where there is a clarity and an understanding that allows people to go into it, with the container taking care of some of the safety, so that people can then lean into more the experience of what's happening. And then if that goes well, you can start expanding some of those boundaries.
Mm. That's great. Great explanation. It's so interesting. Up until a few years ago, I really just had this like real sense that like BDSM was just somehow dirty, like just from the frame of how I was brought up in the world, like to see, intimacy and pain somehow linked together. I just didn't have a reference point for how that could be anything healthy. And I mean, it speaks to my imprint of the world that I was brought up in, and sort of a conservative view around sexuality, and, how I was explained about how sex should look, one partner that you get married to, like, so you see this and you don't even have an idea of what the exploration may even be. So yeah, it just super interesting to start to explore that a little bit more, and to have these spaces, because I think it's so interesting. Because maybe I'll ask this in a question: why do we have such an aversion to the dark? We tend to have a world, maybe the world that I was brought up in, but like it tends to be more that I come across people that are scared of accessing their dark energies and more polarized towards the light, specifically in intimate connections. What do you think is driving that? Is that a cultural thing? Is that a safety thing?
It is absolutely a cultural thing. I mean, if we talk Western societies, and I do realize that this is very, very limiting way of speaking. I know
Thank
you're
you.
from South Africa, and so, like, even me using the word Western, it's Northern Hemisphere based. Like, there's a lot wrong with that. But just
Right.
to to give it a little name, like, in some way, the way that you grew up with and the way that I grew up with had some common cultural denominators that, roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, are connected to, we could say, to Christianity, to the cultural revolution and religious revolution that Christianity was. And Christianity didn't happen in a vacuum. It also was born out of a previous cultural and religious milieu. But to really simplify things, for whatever reason, I won't go too much into that, but Christianity did a very strong operation on divinity, which was to basically, as a first, really, to create the image of a god that was only good, and in a way you
Mm.
could say only light. If you go to the previous iteration of that, which would be the Jewish god of the old gospel, the Yahweh of the old gospel, that god wasn't only good and light. That god could get really angry, and become really scary and dangerous, and also could be very compassionate. So it could be both. It was, in
Uh-huh.
that sense, a bit more of a whole.
Mm.
But Christianity, for whatever reasons, which I'm not criticizing, I'm just expounding,
Yeah, yeah.
converted that God into a God that was all and only good and light, and therefore the humans that were sort of like adhering to that conception of God inevitably tried to make themselves similar to that.
Mm. Oh,
And so the meekness of the Christian martyrs, for the first time in history, became a virtue, to give the other cheek. And that brought a lot of beautiful consequences to humanity. I'm not criticizing it, but also, of course, collaborated or co-created a situation that we find ourselves 2000 plus years later, where, as you say, it's not just in intimacy, actually, it's everywhere. Most of
right.
us in these societies that we're taking as a reference are averse to darkness. And actually, we have come to equate darkness with evil, but it definitely wasn't always like that.
That's a great description. What are the consequences of not accessing these parts of ourselves? What is the outcome of not being connected to these parts of ourselves, besides what I've spoken into here?
Yeah, I mean, on a psychic level, every time we repress or suppress, those two things are slightly different, a psychic content, that comes at a cost that comes at a psychic cost, and the psychic cost is different degrees of psychic tension, not feeling good about oneself, a sense of guilt,
Hmm.
and then all the way to, it could become pathological in personality splits, personality disorders, schizophrenia, and stuff like that. But it doesn't always get to that point.
Right.
But the psychic tension of feeling that I am not in touch with the whole of myself is, in a way, inescapable, because no human being can be consistently in touch with the whole of their psychic
Mm.
reality. So in one way, this is part and parcel of being human. But at the same time, when the division between what's conscious and what is unconscious becomes fixed, sort of like crystallized, and never changed, then you get that situation that was sort of like made into a popular story, into the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When you have someone
Right.
that, whose persona is all beautiful and helpful and impeccable, but then there is a lurking monster that is not evil, it's just repressed and therefore unknown and unnoticed, that is, being to be expressed. And that's when people get into some level of, like, outbursts, or the typical situation of the good family father that does something that no one ever thought they would have been capable of. So there is real, individual and collective costs to the ongoing practice of repressing and suppressing psychic contents. That's not to say that the solution to that is just like letting everything loose, because that's not even possible. But the practice of gently and lovingly getting in touch with what's not being seen in our own psyche, and in the collective psyche, leads to more psychic health. And because physical and societal health are very much connected to psychic health, that just helps.
For sure. Yeah. So in your work with archetypes, and it's because most of the listeners to this show are men, what do you see as some other sort of archetypes that tend to live in the shadow? We've spoken specifically about the wild man, but have you got another couple that you could share that you see in men that we don't access for whatever reason, but tend to be more shadowy?
Or the classic one, and this may be surprising or not to your audience of men, is our inner feminine, right? By virtue, and there's a name for that, there's a technical name for that, which is anima in Jungian vocabulary. Because I'm generalizing here, but most of us were socialized as men. We were told, you're a man.
Yeah.
Great, awesome. So very early on, we learned that certain behaviors and characteristics and even emotions and thoughts were acceptable within that box or label of being a man. And we also learned that some other behaviors, thoughts, feelings that we might have experienced were not acceptable
Hmm.
and were deemed and considered as too feminine. So all of those behaviors, thoughts, even skills got relegated to the shadow. Let's say that I, was born with an incredibly good fine motion that made me really good at doing macrame. Most likely I could have tried once or twice to do that and saw that I was very good at it, but then someone would have looked at me like, "What are you doing? You're a boy. Boys don't do macrame."
Hmm.
So I would have relegated that skill into my shadow.
Right.
So taking this to the extreme, we could say that by the time a man gets to adulthood, there is almost a full-fledged feminine being, with all kinds of traits and pros and cons and tastes and whatever that
Yeah.
lives inside of us and is the collection of all those feminine traits that were not acceptable for us to own. So on one level, it's okay because again, nobody is supposed to be a totality. There's always going to be something that's more in the light and something that's more in the shadow. That's by definition. But getting in touch gently and lovingly with our inner feminine is definitely one of the most powerful things someone that has been socialized as a man can do.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad I asked that because, yeah, such an important part of my journey as well as I've started to work with archetypes and get to know my inner feminine and, some of her gifts and shadows. And like you said, because she's been not she hasn't been in my conscious awareness being raised in South Africa, which is quite a strong masculine, go out there, do this, play group sports, that type of stuff. She tends to be quite young as I get to know her. She's kind of immature in a lot of ways, and so holding space for this young part of myself and really seeing what her beauties are and what her blind spots are has been such a strong journey. But yeah, just realizing that it's like having another person living there that just has been in the corner. No one spoke to her. It's nuts.
Totally, and it's the same for me. My inner feminine is also younger and more immature than my inner masculine.
Uh
And
huh.
then when it gets completely crazy, is that then when you get in the case of heterosexual relationships, for instance, then you partner with a woman that is very likely to have had the opposite experience. So she also holds most likely a more immature boy, let's say, or young man inside. And so on one level, there is the relationship between me and my partner. Here I am, a 47-year-old man with a certain degree of maturity in certain things, and my partner, late 30s. So, we can feel somehow, relatively conscious, but then under the surface, there is another relationship that's happening, and that's the one between my younger inner woman and her younger inner man that may be putting in place all kinds of dynamics that we may feel that we are beyond, we surpass that, but actually it's still there. So it becomes a foursome really, and that's quite interesting and complex.
It's such a beautiful thing to think about because, it's not just, if you're listening to this and you're in a male body in a heterosexual relationship, you think man and woman in a relationship. But as Raf is talking about, yeah, there's really four of you in this partnership and you need to hold space for all of them, recognizing that Diana, my princess, is, yeah, super young and she does have some interesting. She grabs the microphone. I have this analogy of her grabbing the microphone that drives my choices at certain times. And I have a king who I think is pretty together and integrated because I've spent a lot of time refining that role and the strategies that my king brings. But yeah, my princess and my queen, she hardly ever has the microphone. I have a placeholder for her, and I have this mature version of a feminine member of my inner kingdom, but I don't know her very well. Like, yeah, it's new ground for me, and so recognizing that those are places that I can evolve into feels like my work to do. Hey?
It's the same for me. Basically everything you said, I could almost say the same for myself. Like I have this inner, like yogini, sort of like
Cool.
20, 26, 27, probably inner feminine. She's beautiful. But if we talk about mature, feminine is definitely something that I have barely started to experience and not at all landed in my psyche. So that's a fascinating journey.
What's our access point there? I mean, how do we develop that? Is that spending time with those types of older women that are going to mature that part of ourselves? Like, what is your journey there? Because I have it as a placeholder, but I haven't actually quite got the path to maturing my feminine. Is it just a time thing? The more time I get to know Diana, my princess, that she eventually starts to grow with me, lagging behind by about 15 to 20 years, or is there another way to get there?
Well, the good news, I would say a few things here. The good news is that these inner constructs, they age, they mature, but they don't necessarily mature in chronological time at the same speed. So, when I
Mm,
first met my inner feminine, I would say she was about 17, and 3 or 4 years later, she was 28. So,
right.
the
Okay.
maturation was pretty fast in a way. What I have found, and no one knows for sure, but this is my findings, is that what really helps is, yes, to sit with these inner characters and to give them a name. Giving them a name is super helpful. I'm so happy that you mentioned that your inner feminine has a name, so that's wonderful. uh, but what I really found is that what really makes them grow is to is when we allow them to take control. You said grab the microphone, to take control of our body and to make choices, basically. Something as ordinary as what to eat might have a different outcome if my inner
Mm,
masculine or my inner feminine makes the choice. And
interesting.
my inner feminine deciding, for example, for 2 days, everything that we're doing might lead to two very interesting days, that my
Wow.
inner masculine might even disapprove of. So that, there can be tensions
Interplay
there or
for
whatever,
sure. Yeah.
interplay. But basically, by making choices and getting a feedback from life, they grow, right? They, just as we grew by making mistakes and getting it right and getting it wrong, and sort of like letting life grow us. And I think they need
Mm,
to do the same.
so good. Thank you. That's great advice. Anything you want to touch on archetypes before I change lanes here? Is there anything we didn't touch that you feel might be missing from this conversation if somebody hasn't journeyed through this before? I want to get to your work on this because I know you have a whole program and a course on that, which we'll touch on at the end. But is there anything that you feel like would tie a bow on this?
No, I think there's a lot more to say, but this was a pretty good, bite for any audience. And yeah, I think we can leave it at there. And the curiosity around archetypes is raising in general consciousness, which makes
Mm.
me super, super happy, because I feel that by understanding archetypes, we can have a much deeper and richer experience of being human.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for doing this work, and yeah, just excited to explore it a little bit more. I want to ask you about tantric sex. This is a path that you have adopted as I would guess, as a practice, but also as what you teach. Can you define what that is and how somebody might understand tantric sex and how it could support them, maybe personally, and the relationships that they're in?
Sure. I think probably nowadays I would be tending to use more definitions like conscious sex, or integrated sex, but Tantra was definitely for me the way into a different way of understanding sexuality. Um, I use the word tantra and tantric with a bit more caution nowadays because it's very specific to a certain tradition and a certain area of the world, and I think with us, it's important to not just throw it around too much. And I certainly have been guilty of that, particularly in the past. But that said, is a really good doorway to basically say something very powerful and very simple. If we start putting the same awareness on our sexuality that we do, let's say, on our spiritual development, then we will start to discover a million interesting things about our sexuality. And some of them have been discovered long, long, long time ago. And definitely the tantric tradition from India and Kashmir has done an astounding job of, diving deep into the mysteries of sexuality. And some of those we might just discover by ourselves. But usually for men, I would say sort of like the first big totem or portal that appears in front of us when we start really putting awareness on our sexual experience is diving deeper into the mystery of our orgasm and ejaculation processes,
Mm.
which for most men have come to be one and the same, first of all, orgasm and ejaculation, and also something that we have very little say about, or to use a word that I don't love, control, but let's say very little choice about. So most of us, grow up in ways that support us to feel that ejaculation and orgasm happen to us. It's something that happens. We may know ways to get there. We most of the time live them in a way that a bit provocatively, I could say, is somewhat similar to a sneeze. It's just like it
Right.
happens, and then there is some afterglow, pleasant afterglow, and then done.
I
And
love the sneeze
so
analogy.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of it's nice to sneeze, isn't it? And then after
Yeah.
that we get a feeling of like, oh, that was nice, and pretty much end of the story.
Uh-huh.
But through tantric conscious sex, we get a chance to like zoom in and unpack everything that leads up to orgasm and ejaculation, everything that happens during it and after, and also what happens if we consciously choose not to go there. Like to take a different route, so to speak,
Hmm.
where excitement, pleasure, mutual enjoyment are still there, but they do not necessarily end with the sneeze, for us men particularly. And that opens a whole, landscape of possibilities that are very interesting.
So let's do that. What are some of those possibilities, or what could that look like? I mean, for somebody who hasn't heard about this before, we've spoken about it a few times on the podcast, but you're saying a sexual encounter that perhaps doesn't include an ejaculation.
Yeah. So what will happen then? I mean, a few things. First of all, there will be a certain amount of energy that maybe we don't know what to do with. Like the feeling could literally be, "Huh, oh my gosh, I'm full of this energy. It's been great. What do I do with it?" And this is where the way that I at least studied and practiced conscious sexuality was very intertwined with yogic practices to move that energy somewhere. It's like having that amount of energy, for lack of a better word, and moving it somewhere very relatively quickly leads to the discovery that we can use that energy for a million different things. We can use it to clean the house. It's kind of a bit of a meme. The person that has had a sexual encounter, didn't have an orgasm, and now is like frantically cleaning the house. But there's also very creative and elevated ways that we can use that energy. Nothing wrong with cleaning the house. That's beautiful as well. But like we could use it to create poetry, to sing, to do something good with our bodies, like yoga or swimming or running in nature. We could use it to feel inspired about what we do, but it does take some managing. So the first thing that happens is we learn that that sneeze, that orgasmic ejaculatory reflex had the function of dispersing the energy that we had accumulated through the sexual encounter
Yeah.
and basically getting us back to floor zero, which may be good in a sense, but it's not the best thing to do if you're trying to climb a ladder or if you're trying to get somewhere. So that's the first thing that happens, and then further down the line, there's also the the doorway or the portal of separating orgasm and ejaculation, and discovering that you can have one without the other. And that's a different story.
Hmm. Have you got a one or two tips for the separation of orgasm and ejaculation? I know there's a whole process of moving and breathing energy, and I'm asking this as well for me because I haven't found that sweet spot despite a few years of practicing of how to actually separate those two. I've had like one or two full body orgasms that haven't included ejaculation, and I'm practicing ejaculatory choice, meaning I'm in process of like being in lovemaking and not climaxing where I ejaculate, but I don't find an easy path to feel safe enough to edge towards orgasm without ejaculating at the same time. You're like, what? How does that look? I mean, what is the actual practice there? I mean, I know it's years of study, perhaps, but I'd love to, yeah, ask this question for myself.
Yeah, for sure. In my experience and the experience of the people that I have in contact with that have gone down this path, the best way to find orgasm without ejaculation is to forget about it. Like you continue doing what you're doing, you continue sort of like being conscious of your energy, sexual arousal levels, and choosing not to ejaculate,
Yes.
and that's it. And then one day, orgasm without ejaculation happens.
That's sort of
It's
what
not
happened.
something
Yeah.
that we can really make happen. It just happens. And this is also um, in a sense why this form of orgasm is in a sense a more feminine form of orgasm. It's an orgasm that finds you. It's a bit like falling asleep. You don't make it happen. You just relax and breathe and continue doing what you're doing until it happens. And so I know that that can be frustrating because there's no guarantee. There's no one can say it will happen in a month, it will happen in 6 months, it will happen in 9 months. But I would vouch for the fact that it happens. And once it happens, it may feel just like a miracle, but actually, what happened is that the body learns something new, the body and the brain. They learn something new. So once it happens the first time, I would argue that it's much easier that it will happen again because the body learned something that it didn't know. But my advice would be to great, continue doing what you're doing. That's already a lot of you know awareness and a lot of love actually put into lovemaking by looking at it and breathing into it and slowing down when needed and letting go of the patterns of performance and whatever. So that's already incredibly deep and beautiful work. And the hard thing there is for a few months, I would say at least 6 months, maybe nine, maybe 12, to forget about orgasm, like to not even try to look for it and just sort of like park it away, but be open. And then my experience is that it happens by itself.
So good. So I want to give somebody who's listening to this who doesn't even know what the fuck we would even explore this with, maybe talk about some of the levels. So, I heard you say 6 months of no seeking an orgasm. How does that mean you still make love to your partner or to whoever you're connecting with, and you choose to consciously not have an orgasm? Because for most of us, we've been trained that orgasm and ejaculation are the same, meaning every time I orgasm, I also ejaculate. So they are going to this place of riding different levels of pleasure as they're in their lovemaking and then stopping before they get to, let's say, a point of ejaculation. And what could a tool be that somebody could actually use if they were listening to this and wanted to, yeah, at least start experimenting with this?
So the tools for that would be slowing down. Stop. By the way, you can also do this with yourself. It doesn't require a partner, but definitely, doing it with a partner is beautiful and creates a different level of opportunity and challenge. Slowing down, breathing fully and slowly. Some awareness techniques can help. So, like expanding the awareness, because when the more we get closer to orgasm and ejaculation, the more our awareness tends to condense into the genitals. It's like, before we were aware of many sensations and colors and, our breath, our mouth, our fingers, but then it tends to like focus, right before the orgasm. So if we willingly keep the awareness spread, that really helps. Of course, a supportive partner also helps. Someone that is going to be supportive of us stopping, slowing down, saying, hey, I need a little break here. Certain yoga techniques are really, really helpful, but it's very difficult for me to speak about them because they would require like a training, but those resources exist also in the world. And then basically, training our body to separate these two these two phenomenons that have been bundled into a reflex. One is the let's say the accumulation of pleasure and arousal, the building up of pleasure and arousal up to a certain point, and the other one is the very physiological reflex of ejaculation. So we need to be able to stay in one without going into the other for some time. I would say for at least 6 months. It doesn't mean that if you happen to ejaculate within those 6 months, everything is lost, but the intention needs to be there for a sufficient amount of time, and then a few things will start to happen by themselves.
Mm. Yeah, another thing that I think I learned probably through the same school that you work at is this level of recognizing where you go up to like a level 10 where 10 would be an ejaculation, but recognizing that for many of us those last like 7 to 10, like level of intensity can happen quite quickly. And so recognizing that you're actually tracking in yourself how close you are to the edge, where the edge is a 10, and even perhaps communicating that with your partner has been supportive for me. So it's like, okay, I'm currently at a 5, I feel good to keep flowing. Okay, I'm getting close to a 6 or a 7, and then actually coming back and pulling back from there, because it does tend to be a pretty slippery slope from 7 over to 10.
Absolutely, that's what's commonly called the point of no return, which is not the 10, but as you say, for most people it will be a 7. It means that after we reach that level of excitement and arousal, we are not really able to backtrack or to do anything, and 7 to 10 is just like
Mm. What do you think this bringing awareness and presence to sexuality means for men in terms of like awakening or emotions of guilt and perhaps shame around sexuality? Do you think there's a link there between bringing awareness back into this?
I would say so. I mean, generally speaking, whenever we bring awareness to things that have been done for ages by ourselves and also by others that are connected to us through lineage or archetypal connections. So things that have been done for a long time without awareness in a more automatic, way. Like imagine how much unconscious sex happens and has happened in the eons of time. So whenever we bring awareness to that, one of the side phenomenon is that we will potentially find levels and layers of pain, guilt, shame that were just suppressed. So at times it might feel like we're going backwards. It's like, wait a minute, it was so easy before. I just had an urge. The other person had the same urge. We just did it. I scratched their back. They scratched my back, so to speak, and we were all a little bit happier after. And now it feels so complicated. And I can feel the shame, and maybe today, I'm not so connected to my sexual center, so I don't know if I want to do it. Like, it could feel more complicated, but it's also so much more real. And at the end of the day, the reason why we're even talking about this is because one way or another, most people's sexual life doesn't feel great to begin with. So we're putting awareness on it because it doesn't work great already. At least that was my story. I came to Tantra because my sexual life wasn't great. And I was a reasonably, attractive guy that had, some opportunities to interact with girls that he liked. But once we got to intimacy, I was in complete confusion. Things weren't feeling settled or good or rewarding to me. So remembering that the pain of unconsciousness is a good motivator for getting into awareness. Because sometimes when you get into awareness, same with nutrition, if you start bringing awareness to what you eat, you might for a while feel like, oh my gosh, this has gotten so complicated, and I feel shame about food that I didn't know I had, whatever. But it's still a good path to be on, compared to the unconsciousness of what we do.
Yeah, and there's something else there as well. For me, a lot of my life, sexuality was like a break from myself, the chance for me to escape,
Yeah.
or feel good about something, pretty much unconscious, often a lot of alcohol involved or something like that. So not super present. But I was completely unaware that sexuality could be used for healing, for manifestation, for ritual, for, creating more connection. It was really just used for one particular thing, as you said. And so, yeah, the journey of bringing some awareness back has been so rich for me. Eh?
Yeah, same, likewise. And then, like, I think I also want to be clear also with your audience that it's not like I have arrived at any level of perfection, or mastery with that. Actually, like probably most human beings, I also go in spirals, so there's times where I feel myself reverting to an old self, which is unconscious about things I do,
Mm.
unconscious about sexuality, unconscious about how I eat. And then what I'm so glad about is that by having touched some more levels of awareness, at least I have an anchor. I know where I can anchor myself to. And this in many ways, this path has been described by many people as a spiraling path. Like we revisit, as you were saying, like parts that are maybe not even didn't even have the chance to benefit from the progress that we have done, because the progress is not it doesn't affect the whole of us in the same way. But in this spiraling, we are moving somewhere, and there's a choice there, to move towards more awareness and more capacity to feel and see and be with what I am, or to move more into oblivion and numbing and forgetting. And I think that's a choice that we can make each and every day, and it's a very impactful choice.
So good. I'd like to ask you a personal question, which you may or may not answer. What is your ejaculation frequency at the moment? Do you ever ejaculate, and if so, how often? I know you've
No,
been
that's
on
a
this
great
path for a
question.
while.
Yeah, I'm very happy to answer it. So nowadays, I would say my ejaculation frequency is roughly once per month.
Okay.
This is an average though, because one of the things that happened to me, so before I came into ISTA, I was one of the people with a spreadsheet. I had a spreadsheet, still have it somewhere, where I would note each and every time I ejaculated, and my goal was for that to be no more than twice per year, so once every 6 months. And I kept like pretty, religiously to that. However, when I came to ISTA, one of the things that I went through was realizing that all of this beautiful work I had done towards controlling my ejaculation, having my spreadsheet, being super on top of my game sexually, that was wonderful, but it had empowered my masculine side so much that my feminine side was completely, nowhere to be seen.
Mm.
And so when I came into ISTA, I received some good reflections, particularly from female teachers that I respected, that were inviting me to let go of some of that control. Like, not
Mm.
completely, but to find some equilibrium.
Mm.
And so,
Cool.
paradoxically, after entering into ISTA, I started experimenting with releasing that control a minute and seeing how that went. So, within those two parameters, I'm still finding what the right balance for me is. But it's
Mhm.
certainly not the level of scarce or sparse ejaculation that I used to have
Mm.
when I was very steeped into this learning path. I'm still
Mm.
happy that I did it, though, that I had that discipline and that extremism, so to speak,
Yeah.
because it allowed me to break very, very old and conditioning patterns that I had.
Mm.
Also around masturbation and self touch as well.
Beautiful. Um, when you are lovemaking at the moment now, how often do you have an orgasm that's not connected to ejaculation? Is it every time? I know you said it's something that you just wait for and develop. Was it like for you, having been on this path for a while, is it something that happens most times you make love, or every once in a while? Like what is that frequency for you?
That's a very good question. It's certainly not every time. This I can,
Uh-huh.
tell you for sure.
Okay.
It's probably somewhat less than half of the times, if I had to really give a rough estimate. So
No
it's
spreadsheet.
still, yeah, I don't have a spreadsheet for that, but it's still a rare enough phenomenon that I would say, wow, amazing, and mention it to my partner. Also, by the way, I didn't say this, but the wonderful thing about orgasms without ejaculation is that there's no reason why you should have only one of them. Like when they don't always happen, at least to
Right.
me,
Yeah.
but when they happen, sometimes they happen in chain, like
Mm.
three or four or five of them easily.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
it will be like a very mysterious phenomenon that doesn't always happen, but it happens with a certain frequency. So it's not like a one in a million. It might be maybe 40% of the time, something like that.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Okay, a couple questions on leadership before I let you get back to your evening
Sure.
in Spain, in Barcelona. What I heard you on the Easter podcast talking about shamanic leadership. What does that mean to you, and what's the importance of this as a theme?
So that would make for a very long answer, but let's see how I can condense that. And maybe whoever in your audience is really interested to dive deep could go check out that podcast
I'll
as well.
definitely
That
link it in the
we'll,
show notes
we'll,
for
we'll
sure. It
link
was
it.
so good. Yeah,
So I think really at the bottom of this is a reflection on power that I, as many other people, have been reflecting on for a long time. So what does it mean to be in leadership while inquiring around power in a shamanic way? And in a shamanic way basically means in a way that takes into account not just the mind, but also the body, the emotions, the factors that are beyond a simple analytical rational understanding of power that we already have in our culture. So, when we approach power from a shamanic standpoint, for instance, one of the things that we notice, surprise, surprise, is that there is a polarity in power, just as there is a polarity like masculine and feminine in sex, in sexuality, there is a polarity in power, whether you want to call it top and bottom or lead and follow, there's a few ways that we can call it. And so, for example, one of the ways I would say shamanic leadership is different from other forms of understanding of power and leadership is that same as we're saying, okay, you wanna become more shamanically aware, then you need to get in touch with your masculine and your feminine, regardless of your gender and biological sex and sexual orientation. Similarly, if you want to explore shamanic leadership, you need to get in touch with your both of your polarities around power. Like in other ways, it's not just about becoming a good leader, it's also about becoming a great follower. And how can we do that? How can we explore both of those polarities and make space for both and get the juice and the magic of both? And I find that oftentimes, in at least personal development, there is a lot of focus on how to be a leader. Like everyone wants to be a leader. But truthfully, if you cast yourself in the role of a leader for too long, it's similar to casting oneself in the role of the masculine for too long. Something will crack, something will give, something will feel incomplete. And again, something will need to be repressed and suppressed for that to happen. So that's one example.
So what could that look like practically? So someone's leading an organization. How do you step into the follower role? Does that need to happen outside of the organization, or how do you connect to those other polarities?
Unfortunately, many organizations would frown upon, let's say a CEO that says, you know what, everybody, today I'm just going to be, a simple employee at the office. How about that? Like, the organizational structure wouldn't allow for that necessarily. And that's a tragedy. That's very sad, because in shamanic societies, there were these mechanisms where a leader would become a follower occasionally or periodically. But if you cannot do that at work, then maybe you need to, like, if you're in a leadership position, then a good thing to do would be to go out and find a class where you could be a student, like an excited and present student, already that reverses the polarity, and that's really good. For myself, I'll tell you an anecdote. Maybe you know about it, maybe you don't. But in June, like 5 months ago, I went to Anista training as a participant. So that was a way for me to be in the other polarity and really fully go in as a participant and feel how that feels like. And luckily enough, ISTA doesn't frown upon something like that. It actually maybe even encourages it. But other organizations might be different.
I think specifically with the idea of power and leadership being such a projection point for power in many ways, maybe even like a BDSM container to go into like a submissive polarity would be a good space for a leader to, yeah, be in a submissive of like an acceptance place or a place of sitting in a different polarity to where they're being the dominant person, having to make all the decisions, leading, that type of stuff.
And you know what? That's such a classic thing, the CEO that goes to a professional dom and then gets to be
Right.
a submissive person. The only issue with that, I would say, is that it's still really good for the individual, but it's sad and painful if the individual cannot integrate that experience in the story, in the narrative they tell about themselves to the outer world. In other words, if this has to be done in secret, you know, it's sad. It's just so much more healthy and useful for the individual and the community if that CEO could say, "Good morning, everybody," to the board meeting. I feel so good today, and especially because yesterday I went and got dominated by a really good dom.
Yes.
By the way,
Yes.
that's their phone number if you also want to do it. I feel so relaxed.
Yes.
My
It's not in the
anus so
shadow.
relaxed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but who
Mm-hmm.
can actually do that? What corporation would allow them to do that? So that's sad.
Mm. There's a concept in leadership that I've been thinking about over the last few months and years, which is like, how do we the concept I've been thinking of is the integrated leader, which is recognizing that anybody who comes to a leadership position who doesn't put front and center the fact that they have wounds and shadows is sort of a red flag. And I wondered if you have any suggestions or thoughts around how to support leaders with like integrating shadows or bringing shining lights on the parts of themselves that they don't see, because I think specifically in business there's this real difficult opportunity where we tend to have a like a separation in power as a function of the fact that the CEO got the corner office and he pays my salary. It's quite hard to shine a light on that person's shadows and point that out. Have you given much thought to this and how it plays out, and integrating the parts of ourselves? I know we spoke a lot about this through the archetypes, but any thoughts that you've had around this role of leadership and integrating shadow work into leadership?
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought and still am. you know, it's unfortunate because it's a catch 22. Like for me as a leader in ISTA is relatively I got it easy because for me to go front of the line and speak about my shadows and about my wounds is going to be celebrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but for a CEO of a mainstream corporation, asking them to do that almost amounts to asking them to lose their job. So it's a catch 22 that humanity has found themselves many times over into. It requires a critical mass and some brave pioneers to do that before it becomes acceptable. But there are precedents. I would argue, I may be wrong, but I would argue that, let's say, in the 50s, if the CEO of a company went to the board meeting and said, "Oh, good morning, everybody. I'm just coming out of yoga. I just did yoga. Let's start the meeting." Probably people would go like, "Okay, he's gone insane," or she,
Yes.
like what is this weird Oriental thing? Like that's not good.
Yes.
Today, I would probably think that even if you go to like ExxonMobil or something, like some totally sort of like staple, you
Blue
know,
chip.
co-
Yeah.
yeah, and the CEO says that they do yoga, everyone will clap their hands and go like, fantastic. How do we get from A to B? How do we get from there to here? Probably by a few daring CEOs going, fuck it. I don't care if they think it's not a good idea. I'm gonna do yoga and I'm gonna say to the whole world, and similarly with people coming out about being gay, it's abnormal until it's not.
Right.
And how to get there is by continuing to push the envelope. So for me, really, what you're talking about is the next frontier for both in business and in politics. Because just imagine what would it be like if any major candidate to any presidential election or the leader of a political party went out up in front and said, "Hello, everybody. This is my plan. This is my policy view, and these are my shadows or some of my shadows and wounds that I have being made aware of." We're not there by any stretch of the imagination. But could we be there in 50 years? I think so. It's possible. But it takes bravery and courage to be the first, that reveals their vulnerability when vulnerability and power are not yet part of it's that connection is not yet understood by mainstream consciousness at all.
And there's so much growth there. Like the organization that really trusts the CEO, or the country that trusts its politician, that really brings its the full version of himself and says, yes, I have shadows and I'd love you to point out anything else that I'm not seeing. Like, it seems so obvious in some ways. It's like that's got to be the way to build trust. And in a world where trust is fucking hard to come by in very big businesses, like, it seems like the way to do it. It just, like you said, maybe just breaking an old paradigm.
Yep, it takes a critical mass, I would argue. And at the same time, there's probably something like the 100-month key effect in this. When enough people have done it, it will feel just absolutely normal. Just as nowadays, at least in some countries, it wouldn't be a cataclysmic revelation if some major politician came out about being gay or about being single. Like, there was a time when even the fact of being single or divorced would have been a
Mm,
problem for someone in a position of power.
yeah.
And so things are moving, but we're not quite there yet, I would say.
Bro, thank you so much for taking the time to drop in and for, yeah, sharing the wisdom that you carry on all of these topics. I think they've been super valuable for me, and yeah, for those listening to this, I'd love to yeah, share what are you working on at the moment that you want to share with the world. I know you've got some archetype work. Maybe give us a little overview of that and how people can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, yes, as you know, I'm involved with ISTA. So anyone who is interested in that can go to ISTA's website. We'll put the link and find me if they're feeling, the inspiration or the motivation to do one of the ISTA trainings with me. And then aside from that, I'm very, very passionate about archetypes work, particularly the connection and nexus between archetypes and shamanism, archetypes and depth psychology. And I love bringing this work to everybody, but specifically also to anyone who's in a position of like leading groups or being a therapist or a facilitator of any kind. So the first thing that I am um, offering and has had incredible success so far is a masterclass on archetypes. This is a 2.5 hour intensive online container. It's like a basically a pressure cooker about archetypes. Learn a lot, ask a lot, get exposed to a lot of good quality information, and up a level your game with archetypes. I'm gonna hold one exactly in almost a month from now, on November 21st. So we'll put the link on that.
Awesome.
And then some more other offerings on archetypes are cooking, and I'm gonna be sure to share them with you when they're ready to be shared. Other than that, there's also my personal website. Your audience is very welcome to go there. Some good content on some articles on sexuality there, what we spoke about, some articles on power, some academic writing for those of the listeners who kind of like that language. So, yeah, everyone is welcome to connect to my portal, and there's a lot to read there and some ways to interact with me.
Beautiful. And anything you want to share in closing, or something that you wish that we'd maybe covered here that you didn't get a chance to dive into? Maybe.
I think I just want to be grateful to you, Garrett, because it's been a while since I had the opportunity to connect specifically with male audience. I mean, I am aware that there may be also women amongst your followers and audience, but mainly, so it just feels very sweet, about 10, 12 years ago, I started doing very, very deep men's work, and it's brought me so much, and it's been such a cornerstone of my development. And so, just looping back to that, and I can visualize, almost behind you, all the curious and interested and passionate men and women that are interested in men's work as well as male archetypes, and I feel it's so important. So maybe the last parting words for me, in concluding this, is like, thank you for being men that are willing to examine yourself and to study yourself and to become aware, because man masculinity, women femininity, archetypes, all of this is part of the human experience, and I'm so glad that people are coming with curiosity and love to this teaching. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, bro. Yeah, I really appreciate you, and thank you for the work you're putting into the world and for the flavor that you bring, both online and to conversations like this, but also into the ISTA containers. Yeah, it was such an important journey for me. Having been inside the men's circle that you held inside my first ISTA training was, yeah, like an important point of putting me onto the path that I'm on now. So I just want to honor you and say thank you for that, brother.
Thank you likewise.
Till next time, brother. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.